Well, welcome to question 57 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic is right, and we're introducing this new topic of justice, one of the cardinal virtues, and the longest text of the cardinal virtues. Hop right into it. Uh, the first four questions that we'll be dealing with, rights, justice itself, injustice, and judgment, are all really under the header of justice itself. We're dealing with the question right now of what is justice. So we're starting off with the question of uh, is it a right? Is the object of justice right? Uh, and right in the Latin is jus, Jus. It means right, power, authority, uh, and is when you're reading it in the Latin, it's almost a bit repetitive. So it's like, well, is uh, just is is juice the direct object of uh, istuatue, and the answer is almost obvious because the words are nearly the same. The first, you can also spell the JUS with IUS, so in that way, it's almost the beginning of the word. So it seems quite obvious that right is the object of justice. Um, Justice deals with fairness and equity. I think justice makes more sense when you look at these four different parts of justice itself. So that will flesh out. Um, but any Catholic who is somewhat familiar with the Latin Mass, even if you only know a few lines of it by heart, one of them that you might know is in the preface, whereas dignum et justum est. Uh, it is right and just. You might know that in English from the Mass. It is right and just. Right and justice must be, um, hand in hand. But in the Mass, it's dignum et justum est. Dignum is more like appropriate. It is appropriate and right. So right in there, justum is uh, using the term juice. It's almost like saying more literally, it is appropriate and justice uh, to give thankfulness to God. So I think from a Catholic perspective, it's going to be quite clear that if justice is uh, being thankful to God, that kind of changes the direction of our approach to justice. Um, and justice is a habit. It's virtues. It's also, because it's a virtue, moral virtue, uh, a cardinal virtue. It's related to having a habit, and it's a habit that makes people capable of doing just actions. Um, uh, Justice seeks what is right. Go into some of the different articles and objections and responses to objections in this section. Uh, there's four different articles, so it's a little bit longer than usual. Uh, Justice directs a person in his relationship with others. So and he said it's different than most virtues. Most virtues you're dealing with your relationship with yourself. So proper order, proper relationship to yourself versus uh, uh, justice, which is really dealing with your relationship with other people. Um, when we get into the next question 58 goes into that a bit more, where it's clear that it's really in relationship to other people is the main focus of this virtue. Um, and he said also that St. Thomas says that virtues all have to be done in a certain way. So you have to be truthful in a certain way. You have to be, you have to have the various different virtues in a certain way. Whereas justice is always right. It's one of the features of justice is that you can't do justice wrong. And you'll see as we get into this, because there's safeguards in there. If justice were to be done, do it, if being just would create an injustice, then you have equity or something to counterbalance that injustice. So built right in with injustice is that it is always done in the correct way. You don't have to add on another virtue in order for it to be done correctly. This is the other virtue that other people use. Um, is points out that sometimes people get confused by justice because there's so many different words associated with justice. So there is justice as a thing, as an object. That's what is right. Um, that's pretty much what we're talking about in this question is what is right. Um, but then there's also the art of justice, which would involve lawyering or lawmakers, policing, military, people who are engaged in the action of ensuring justice. Uh, and then we have the place where justice is administered, halls of justice, maybe the Capitol building or the courthouses or something like that, which are the places of justice. Justice Department is built into the name. And then there's the office that exercises justice, which would be the judge who exercise justice. So sometimes if people were to have a problem with policing, they might have a problem with justice, but it's really not justice that's the problem. It's the art of justice. Or people might have a problem with judges, but again, it's not justice itself. It's the office uh, of exercising justice that's the problem. He describes it as he's recognized the challenge, the difference between rights and law. So law is not the same as a right. It's an expression of a right. Laws are an expression of a right. It's not the same word. It's lex. And laws are. He describes it as a craftsman. So as a craftsman, first has an idea of uh, the pot that they're going to make at the potter's wheel or the table they're going to make at the carpenter's uh, desk. They have the idea, which is in some sense perfect. When they actually get about to making it, it depends on the skill of the craftsman. So uh, the idea of law is ideal, is very synonymous with something that's right. Um, but in reality, once gets put into practice, politics gets involved, and all these human human errors get involved, and laws often do not echo what is right. Laws for Thomas Aquinas is laws are intended to direct man towards virtue. Now, laws don't all direct man towards virtue, but that's because not because law in an ideal sense is wrong or that right is wrong, is that the craftsmanship is wrong in the making of it. Uh, the justice before all subjects man to God. So Fast is the term of divine law. It's God's perfect plan, and it's not fully knowable to all humans. Versus just this idea of right, this section, is human law, and it's an ordinance of reason for the common good. So it's aiming for the common good, but it's a human law. So people cannot be. St. Thomas says people cannot be perfect, cannot perfectly repay God in terms of fast. I think that's quite clear within the letters of St. Paul that human beings are incapable of repaying what is owed to God. If humans were capable of repaying what is fully owed to God, you wouldn't have Jesus. You wouldn't have had the crucifixion. That's quite obvious. But justice tends to make man repay God as much as he can. um, this idea of reparations, that we must repay God what we can, as much as we can, because that's what justice requires, right? We owe a tremendous debt. If you owe $10,000 and you only have $500, um, well, you can't repay the 10,000, but it would be an injustice if you didn't pay back anything when you had the 500. maybe you can only pay back 100 of the 10,000, but it's better to pay back the 100 than to pay nothing. And nothing is all even an even greater injustice. Um, it says that we can repay God. This section he doesn't really talk, about this is about mortification of the body or something like that, by more fasting or something like that, but by subjecting man's mind, our mind, to God entirely. Uh, Fasting and corporal works of mercy move us towards aligning our minds with God, then that should be done. But the goal is to align one's mind with God as a way of repaying God for the debt that we owe Him. He points out in Article 2 this issue of positive and natural rights. Um, well, rights, yes, the term we're using, is a work that is adjusted to another person according to some type of equity. So again, related to another person, um, and it's about paying back a debt that we owe to others within our society. He says that there is a natural right there, and that's in some sense like a quid pro quo. If somebody works for you, then you owe them pay. you owe if they're your employee, you have to pay them. They work for you, you pay them. It's a natural right. This idea of I don't take your property, you don't take my property. That's a natural right. Um, it's just if this, then that. It's a natural thing. Would have put us on a desert island, maybe we would work out some type of natural rights agreement just for this, for that. Um, he also says then uh, there's common consent, which is another way of doing it. That's not the natural rights, but common consent. And he said there's two kinds of common consent. First is private agreements. So, private contract, which I'm not sure is that different than that first first example that he gave, the quid pro quo. Um, Except it doesn't have to be fully balanced, I guess, because you could agree to anything in terms of a contract, but it's just a private agreement. He doesn't really classify this. He says the first one is natural rights, and this second category is positive rights. But this middle one, he really doesn't classify. But I think it's so closely aligned to the first one that it's probably some form of natural rights. That second one is the public agreement, and it's by decree of the prince, by decree of the government, by the decree of the church. It's a positive right. So um, we hand over certain rights to authority in order for them to make rules and positive rights that help society to better function. So we hand over our ability, the rules of the road to the government, and they say, well, on this road, this will be the speed limit, and you will stop here, and you can take a right or left here, depending on the sign. You can yield here. Um, a lot of rules are created about driving. Um, well, we've handed that over to the government to determine what is the best way to drive in terms of the rules, because practically speaking, we can't all function on our own individual rules, our own subjective rules. We have to come to some type of agreement, and we can't vote on everything, every detail, and we can't do it every year. Red lights don't become green lights by popular vote on a yearly basis. We don't change traffic rules that much. Um, we're just happy to hand that over in order to have the proper ordering. It's not a uh, morally right or wrong way of doing it. One way or another would be fine, just so long as we all agree. That's how driving works. Um, so that would be a positive right. There's some element in divine right, which we get later too, which is kind of a positive right, but not by the government, but by God, where it's more of a decree rather than it is a between individuals. Are positive rights needed, or do we only need natural rights? I guess that would be the question. Like, do we need a government? do we need to have? Do we need to hand over any authority to anybody else in order to govern in any way, or should it just be quid pro quo? Should our society run by quid pro quo? Now, if you're a libertarian, you'd probably say the quid pro quo way is the best way. Um, But St. Thomas doesn't say that. He says, and he brings up this story, and he brings it up again, is the story of the madman and the depositor. Depositor is a legal term. It's still in American law, this idea of a depositor, um, common law countries, um, where if you were to hand over your gun or at that time a sword to somebody to hold on to it, you hand it on to them to hold on to it for you, and then they write a note saying, whoever owns this note will get it back. Will get it. That's the beginning of paper money, is this idea of a deposit and depositor. You could trade that piece of paper with somebody else for something else, because whoever had the piece of paper had the right to get this property back. Because not everyone had a safe store everything, so you keep it with the depositor. So in the story of the madman has handed over a weapon, a sword, to the depositor, and by natural rights, the person who has that piece of paper should be able to go back and get that sword. Um, no questions asked. Hand over the paper, you get the sword. But if the person has gone mad, and they are clearly mad, it would be a bad idea to hand a crazy person a sword. The same thing would be an alcoholic or somebody who's under the influence of drugs, mental illness, right? You don't hand over weapons to people who are no longer rational. They've lost their rational sensibilities because of some type of deficiency. Um, so he says, the commonweal, which is the common good, demands a modification of natural rights. So natural rights are fine, but we can't have unbridled natural rights. The common good, which would be then run by political, this idea of positive rights, the laws of the land are sometimes needed to curb um, natural rights. Do positive rights even exist then? Oh, well, I think that's quite obvious that they do. If a law is contrary to reason, it is contrary to natural rights, and the human will cannot make it right. He says positive rights, though, uh, can be contrary to natural rights. So we just saw in the last example where natural rights are somewhat deficient. You need positive rights in order to balance justice, because you don't want to give the madman a weapon for the sake of the common good. In this instance, sometimes there's a conflict between natural rights, and positive rights have overstepped their bounds. So he gives an example of a law decreeing it lawful to commit adultery or to steal, for example, might be a positive right, but it's not a natural right. There's no natural right to violate reason. And both stealing and adultery are violations of the rational soul. So he said there are bad laws. There can be bad laws, and bad laws don't make it right. Bad law is a bad law. Um, in that case, you should follow natural rights. So in some cases, you should pick positive rights over natural rights. In other cases, you should pick natural rights over positive rights. There's no easy solution of just saying that there's only one way. He also talks about divine rights, which is both natural rights and positive rights in a sense. So divine right is commands that certain things that are good and forbids and other things are evil. Uh, so some things Scripture says, "Thou shalt not murder." Well, is murdering wrong because God said it, or did God say it because it was wrong? The idea that God sometimes says things are for our own good because God says them because they are true. That's the only reason. So a person who could be atheistic or not had never read scripture before in their life could come to the same conclusion. You know, it says don't eat seafood that's been left out all day. Well, you can violate that, but there will be natural consequences to that. You don't need God to tell you uh, not to do something. Um, the other kind is, well, others are good because they are prescribed, and others are evil because they are forbidden. So this is harder to find an example of these situations, but these are things that are only good because God said they're good, or only bad because God says they're bad. We could probably find this more in the kosher laws, uh, the Old Testament more than the New Testament. So there's a lot of things in there. Um, where they're forbidden, not necessarily because they're intrinsically disordered, but because they are part of the purity code or something like that. So they don't make it doesn't make it any less binding because it's in the second category. But the second category is more like positive rights. They're rights, they're decrees based on authority, not based on a natural relationship, but because of the authority of before it was the government. But this would be the authority of God. The first part, God saying that murder is wrong because it is wrong, pointing out what is more like a natural right. So in some sense, divine right is both natural rights and positive rights, and it's more heavily, particularly as a Christian, focused towards natural rights. Most things that are wrong are innate; they're within the human nature to know that they're rational. Uh, most sins as we go through the Summa. Um, most virtues are really virtuous because they lead us to happiness, and most vices are really vices because they make us unhappy. There's You don't really need a divine command to tell us that. Reason is enough. It also talks about the rights of nations versus natural rights. So um, there are rights within each nation, and then there's the rights of all nations. So kind of two distinctions. Um, the natural right is that which is, by its very nature, is adjusted to another person. So says there are natural rights uh, in two ways. One is the natural production of offspring, something like that. So man and woman fall in love, they come together, they, they have intercourse, and they bear children. That's a natural right. It's a natural relationship between the two. The two have this relationship because justice is dealing with relationships between multiple people. This is a relationship that has natural consequences to it. Um, the second one is a relationship between two individuals or multiple people where it results in something like private property. So, um, who has a right to the United States of America? It's not natural in the sense of offspring. It's not natural in that sense. But if you are the people who are here, the land is not being cultivated in any way, and now you are cultivating it and using it and giving it value and using it to produce a good, uh, you have a right to it naturally. Um, as a utility, because that's a useful way that society is organized. And this is something that's talked about a lot. Aristotle, Rousseau, Locke, this idea of who owns a tree? What does it mean to own a tree? What does it mean to own land? Well, most of the time, what they come to is that based out of utility. If somebody was not using it, giving it value, then if the first person who makes value out of it, it becomes theirs. And then once it's theirs, they can do with it as they please. Um, they used a line from Gaius. Whatever natural reason decrees among all people is observed by all equally and is called a right of nations. In the second objection, they bring up the issue of natural slavery, which could be its own video, and maybe it will become its own video again. But he's really St. Thomas Aquinas. All he does is he repeats Aristotle. So in some ways, there's nothing new. There's nothing that Christianity has added to the topic of slavery that didn't exist in ancient Greece. But Aristotle was a bit uh, perhaps progressive on the slavery issue at the time, although today people can use the same writings against him as a sign that he was not strong enough against slavery. But really, he said first, when we get into slavery, you have to think. You can't think of the African slavery in the United States, this large scale slavery of the abduction of entire tribes of other people, huge amounts of people dying in the boat rides, the type of abuse that they endured for generations. This is a different type of slavery than the slavery that Aristotle was talking about in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, um, they were often conquered people, and it wasn't racial, and it wasn't necessarily generational, um, and it was either be turned into a slave or be killed because you're talking about people who were in an army against you. And a smaller scale too. These are not running major plantations, but more people around the house or people doing small labor. So in some ways, I know some people don't think that's a very interesting distinction, but I think it's still important to point it out as a distinction. What Aristotle has said about the ethics of slavery was that there's no group of people who are naturally predisposed to be slaves. So, unlike the American slave experiment, where they thought that everybody who was African was uh, children of Ham, and God had commanded that we could enslave this entire race of people. There was the divine will to enslave these people because um, they were not really human beings. They were meant to be slaves. Well, that part, that's that this idea that people are naturally slaves, like an entire group of people are naturally slaves. Aristotle rejects that outright. There is no room to say the Egyptians were meant to be slaves, the Africans were meant to be slaves, the Native Americans were meant to be slaves. No, there is none of that within Aristotle, and because of that, there's none of that within Aquinas. The second kind of slavery is the kind that Aristotle approved of. Uh, Scandal. The kind of slavery he approved of uh, is ones where it's useful for the man to be ruled by the wiser man, and the latter is helped by the former. So the only type of slavery Aristotle approved of is when the slave is enriched by being the slave. Um, they have benefited more by being a slave than by being free. They have their life is better. It's a better life for them in every way, for them being a slave rather than free, and uh, and also that the the person who is the master, the owner of the slave, is also better for having the slave. So both need to benefit. It has to be mutually beneficial for the in the slave master relationship for that to be ethical. And St. Thomas said the second option, one I just described, is natural, but the first one, an entire race of people are intended to be slaves. That's not natural. That's not natural. So that is a positive. That first one is a positive right of a nation that's made a law that has gone beyond what is naturally allowed. Um, that obviously is controversial for a lot of people, and say, how can this apply? Maybe I should just keep my mouth shut on how this can apply today. But um, when I see in the streets, uh, people who are severely mentally ill or so mentally ill that they're living on the streets and with drug and alcohol problems to such a degree that they're living on the streets. Um, some people can make claims that some drugs should be legalized, whatever it is. But if it has resulted in you becoming homeless and living under a bridge and begging, I think it has gone too far. I think that's clear enough, easy enough, non-controversial statement. These people, on their own, with their autonomy, are not doing well. I think that's fair enough to say. They're not doing well. Under this model, could some of these people be better off if they were forced come off the street and to be under somebody else's direction? Um, well, in some way, that's a little bit like a group home, right? You're saying, you have to come off the street. Here's a bed. Here's 3 meals a day. Here's some work to do. You got to get in treatment programs. You got to get sober. You got to take your medications for mental illness. You got to do these right things. Uh, and you're warm and you're safe and you're well fed and you have health care. Yeah. So the person, in some ways, has forfeited some freedom. Uh, but what they have gained is sobriety and mental health and physical health, right? So there's something that's been gained by the only thing with the group home is the people who work at the group home aren't benefiting necessarily from the people who they look after. So in this way, they would be saying, no, you have to go to work, you have to make money to support this program. You need to support this. It has to be mutually beneficial. Um, and that way, we don't really have much that's like that right now in our society. But that would be a type of thing that Aristotle would allow. If we ever did have a type of thing like that, we wouldn't call it slavery, right? So, in some sense, Aristotle's version of slavery, we would probably, if we had something like that today, we would call that some type of innovative social program that wouldn't necessarily be called slavery. So I think, again, not to beat a dead horse, but the slavery approved by Aristotle and Aquinas would not be considered slavery today. What we think of as slavery is option number one, of which both Aristotle and Aquinas rejected as unnatural and not correctly to be done. Um, there's rights of individual nations, and Aquinas says, writing in the medieval period, he's saying there's no special institution to establish equality and international law since they are instituted by natural reason itself. So this idea that the rights of nations, there is no nation to rule all nations. There's no body policing to guard all nations. Uh, natural reason itself is the reason for is the governing principle. Now we have the United Nations and the ICC courts like that, but even now they're not very binding. The United States has hardly signed on to any of these. Um, and if you look at the laws within the UN, a lot of them are talking about when they try to agree on something, they're often natural reason itself is the guiding force. This idea of human rights is kind of this universal rights. It's not based on any one particular set of laws, but aiming at discovering what the natural rights are, which I think is interesting. It's not that far from what Aquinas had said. Um, now, this commensurate justice, and we're approaching the end at this point. And there's different types of justice. So justice is our relationship with other people within a society. So there's different ways to be in relationship with different people within society because different relationships are different within society. Then different forms of justice are part of society. So that makes sense. What is justice for a relationship between husband and wife is different than our relationship uh, between an employer and an employee. Therefore, the justice between an employer and an employee would be different than the justice between a husband and wife. I think that's quite obvious, and that's basically what it's saying. So the simple justice, that's between equals within the state. So uh, me and citizen X, we are equals under uh, under the justice system of the United States. So we're not equal to the president in some way, but I am equal to other citizens under the state. Um, uh, and in the last response, he has number 4 and number 3. He points out you do have to look at each class of people as well. So the military would be treated as a class of people. Politicians are a class of people. Law enforcement are a class of people. Clergy is a priest. Clergy is a class of people. So there's certain justice that's particular to a class of people as well, not just because of their duties within a society. Their duties have established a particular type of justice that's more fitting for them based on that. And this all exists within American law. You know, the duty of a lawyer to uh, client that has a special set of justice, you know, because there's a particular relationship between a lawyer and a patient, or a doctor and a patient. So justice is set up differently based on class, but really the aim is equality between all citizens. There's paternal justice, which is the right of a parent over their children. This is different than in Aristotle's perspective. In Aquinas' perspective, a child is not the same as an equal. They're not your equal. There's a piety there. There's a filial love. There's a filial justice. There's a justice owed to your parents, and a duty that parents owe to their children. That's not the same duty, um, right, that you owe to everybody else in society, because that's a very particular relationship between children and parents. And he says these other two are very similar to paternal justice, but they're not under paternal justice. They're not a form of paternal justice, but they're very similar to paternal justice. So they really should probably be number 1, 2, 3, and 4. But Saint Thomas numbers it 1 and 2 and says, and these other two are like are the other ones are like paternal justice in some sense. That between a master and a servant is called uh, dominative justice. Probably wouldn't say master and servant today, unless you're looking at old law books. But you know, employee, employer. Um, um, there's clearly not a perfect equality between the employer and the employee. One's the boss, right? The boss has certain power over the employee. So that's a particular relationship. So there's a particular justice involved, right? If a person works, you owe them pay at the end of the day. That's part of the justice owed in um, an employee-employer relationship. There's also the justice between a husband and a wife, which he calls domestic justice. And although he looks to St. Paul and says, well, in some sense, wives are to be subservient to their husbands, he says, well, but really, husbands and wives are really very equal. You know, you're dealing with two adults. They have a particular consensual relationship. They both together are a public face of the family, and both of them deal with um, relating to the community in their own ways. Right? Women at the time might have dealt with community in various ways, and men in a different type of way. But both of them are uh, involved in communal life, both men and women. So because of this, it's not uh, um, nominative or paternal, it's domestic, which is its own relationships, its own type of relationship between spouses. And people should be given their due under the particular type of justice that they are related to, which I think makes sense. It's kind of these are special virtues in some sense, but in some ways, justice is always a special virtue, since what is owed to one is not necessarily owed to another in the same exact way. It has to be kind of specific, otherwise it could become injustice, which we'll see when we get to equity. In conclusion, uh, just is the basis of justice. Right is the basis of justice, and it aims to properly order relationships within a society. Um, and that's very important. That it's really not about you as an individual entirely. It's what regulates our relationships between us and other people, our spouses, our children, our bosses, our employees, our neighbors. All of that is part of this section, which is why it's such a big section. Uh, Not all positive rights are natural rights. True, and sometimes natural rights are needed, sometimes positive rights are needed um, in order to properly balance actual justice. Otherwise, you could make an injustice by just following one thing straightly. Just whatever's natural is perfect. Whatever's the government says is perfect. Well, if you do that, you'll go wrong at some point. So you have to this balance of natural rights and positive rights, and divine rights, really. Um, the rights of nations is both natural and a matter of utility. It's really both. So this idea that you're born in a land and that you kind of become a citizen naturally by where you're born. There's a natural element to who your neighbors are. Your neighbors are who you organically have grown up with. But there is a utility element of it too. That it works. So if it works, then it's part of the rights of nations as well. Um, so something like there are nobody who's naturally born a slave, but there are people who, if they were in that relationship, and again, if you're only catching the end, you should watch that. We talked about that slide a few slides back. But there are some people who, if they lost some of their freedom, their autonomy, there could be a utility to it being more beneficial for them and for society, for the common good, the common weal. Um, could be controversial, but I'm just here presenting Aquinas. So if you don't like it, talk to Aquinas. Um, Commensurative justice means that all people should receive according to that proper ordering of the relationship. So um, if uh, as we just said just last slide, family members are going to be have a different form of justice than uh, employers, or our neighbors, or our government. So really, justice has to be narrowly applied. It can't be just generally thrown out there. It has to be specific, because then every relationship, every act of justice will be right. So it's built right within justice that every action of justice is a right action. So this was the section on right, juice. We'll see you next time when we look at justice itself under the topic of justice itself. Look at justice. Okay. Have a great week.